Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the legal status of child marriage in Canada, which does allow people under the age of 18 to marry. Now, David, one of the things that stood out to me, I've watched some interviews with survivors of child marriage, and when they are asked about their experience, they say one misconception is that people believe in a kind of moral relativity. They say, people come to them and say, well, maybe that's acceptable in your religious community or your cultural community. Child marriage is totally normal in that community. And they say that that is actually a misconception that enables abuse. So what can you tell me about that conception about this moral relativity where perhaps people think it's justified for that group of people, but not for other parts of Canada?
I think you'll find that's a mistake. I don't think you'll find any organized community that stands up for child marriage. If you look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that's, as far as I know, the only United Nations convention that is signed and ratified by every single country around the world except for the United States. And for the United States, the reason has nothing to do with child marriages; it's got to do with the death penalty. But it's, I mean, one thing the global community agrees on is they're opposed to child abuse. So the notion that there's some communities that find it perfectly acceptable is just not correct.
Alissa, so then what is the rationale? Why does Canada allow people to get married at 16 before they can vote or drink alcohol or rent a vehicle, before their brains are fully developed? What is the rationale that we have in this country for making the age of consent to marriage 16?
To be honest, Christine, I would love to know. Um, Canada's way out front in terms of trying to advocate for an end to child marriage internationally. And as far as I can tell, it's a bit of an inconvenient truth that we continue to legally permit child marriage in this country. To follow up on the point of relativity, I'd like to say that child marriage is a human rights abuse, bar none. And so that's the purpose of human rights, right? They don't apply selectively to different groups.
They're
And
universal.
so
It's the
they're
Universal
universal.
Declaration of Human Rights.
Right. So there's no exception there that says it's a human rights violation unless you belong to community X, Y, or Z. Not the case. So there's no exception for that. As to why Canada continues to permit this, I'm not entirely sure. I'd like to say that I spoke to a child journalist about this issue earlier this week, Amico Xmas Carroll, who's looking into this issue. They wrote to Canadian ministers as part of their investigation and didn't get a single response except from Justice Canada, who reiterated the point that, well, we require parents to consent to the marriage of children.
Even though
One
parents may
other
be
thing
the ones
that's
pushing the marriage in those cases. David,
exactly.
one of the things I want to also address is the kind of maybe devil's advocate argument. So how would you respond to the argument that there are going to be some people who want to get married at 16 and that case doesn't involve force or abuse or a large age discrepancy and they should be free to marry, especially when arguments like that are coming from maybe minority religious communities who do have a charter right to freedom of religion, and they may be making the argument that it violates their religious freedom to prohibit marriage. What's your response to that argument that's sometimes put forward?
When you're dealing with human rights of adults, freedom is an important and perhaps foundational value. When you're dealing with children, the foundational value is the best interest of the children, not freedom. Children will often want to do things that are not in their best interests, and it's up to adults to say, no, don't do it. So the notion that children should be free to do what they want, even when it's not in their best interests, is well, it's contrary to the best interest of children, and it's contrary to human rights.
Alissa, what are the developmental and maybe socioeconomic consequences of a child getting married? What do we know about that?
So the reason that this is considered a human rights violation is all of those consequences that you're pointing towards, Christine. So we've got strong evidence that if a girl marries as a child, she's much more likely to begin having children of her own at a much earlier age, which makes it much more likely that she leaves school early, which of course has knock-on effects, makes it difficult for her economically later in her life. And in fact, we see that girls who marry as children are much more likely to live in poverty than girls who marry at later ages.
And living in
There are also
poverty and living without an education makes it a lot more challenging to leave a marriage if it is abusive. We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back.